I'd like to just say one or two things, basically, regarding Lagos State and their approach towards the housing sector. I find it very progressive. They've done something that I find to be quite surprising for me personally, because I'm very competitive. They've managed to recognize the key stakeholders in this current environment and bring everybody together. Today, I will be speaking on the developers' roles and expectations on behalf of my fellow developers. Much has been said about the state of the housing sector in Nigeria today, from the issue of land use and land utilization to the issues of affordability, the size of the deficit, and the issue of finance. The issue of the deficit is one that I find quite amusing, actually, because I've heard, I think I will continue hearing today, the size of the deficit is usually given at 17 million housing units. Now, I've been hearing that figure for, I think, over 5 years. I think what was done sometime in the past was they looked at the population of Nigeria, 170 million people, 10% of that is 17 million, and that was kind of like set as the housing deficit. It is a bit worrying that we currently don't know exactly what this deficit is. A few weeks ago, at the signing of the MOU with Lagos State Government and NMRC, one of my colleagues mentioned that was actually a moving target. I think that's a very apt way to look at it, basically. Developers basically interact and interface with all other parties in the ecosystem. So when we talk about the landowners, basically, most of the time the financiers are landowners, there's little connection between them. The developers, we are there from the very beginning to the very end. So we deal with the landowners, whether negatively or positively. Part of one of the progressive, I think, steps taken by Lagos State Government, the Omodile issue has been resolved, I think, through legislation recently. That really should make things a lot easier. In terms of the building material suppliers, we are really exposed to fluctuations in price of building materials, things like that. We have to address those. In terms of financing, we are faced constantly. I'm sure every single developer here will tell you he's faced constantly with people who have demand for housing units, but the issue of finance, it's really a bit of a challenge. Strangely enough, I was at a meeting yesterday with some members of staff of an oil major, basically. Now, you would assume a group like that would have zero issues getting finance. Surprisingly, there were still a number of different issues. I think we were on the third financier at that point in time. Sector can be looked at from two perspectives. The first is the construction of actual affordable housing units by the developers. This is often achieved through proper land utilization, trying to build a bit higher, basically, taking into account the cost of the land. Intelligent design that takes cost and time required for construction into account. And then we look at building technology to help us address these issues, and then the use of the right building materials. Hence, in the longer term, addresses the issue of high interest rates to some degree. But then, as developers, we face a major challenge from the initial inception or initiation of the project, basically. Funds have to be provided for land acquisition, things like that, starting work till you get to a point where you've reached like a habitable level, and then the mortgage companies can actually come on board. This essentially results in a situation where developers are required to source for funds to take the developments to that level at the barest minimum. This funding is usually sourced, once again, at very high rates of interest, and the high cost of finance serves to further increase the price of the housing unit and reduce affordability. Okay, now in recent times, basically, the parties in the housing sector ecosystem have started to make concerted and cohesive efforts to address these issues. The establishment of Mortgage Funding Warehouse Limited, and I look forward to hear more from them later, and the recent signing of the MOU between private sector developers working on the Lagos Affordable Public Housing Scheme, Nigerian Mortgage Refinancing Company, and the Lagos State Ministry of Housing are examples of some of these efforts. We expect that these developments will help reduce the entry barrier and empower buyers financially by bridging the gap between initiation and eventual refinancing.